300 people watched my husband lift a microphone and turn me into the punchline of the evening. "We'll start the bidding at $20, Richard said, grinning out at the room the way a man grins when he's certain everyone already loves him. "Who wants to take this useless wife off my hands?" The laughter came quick. It rolled across the ballroom like it had been waiting all night for someone to give it a reason. A man near the champagne fountain lifted his paddle just to be part of the bit. Somebody whistled. I stood there in the pearl gray dress I'd chosen for this exact evening, and I did not cry. I did not reach for the microphone. I simply looked at him. Then a voice came from the back of the room, low and unbothered. $1,000,000. And the whole ballroom went still, as if someone had turned off the air. I want to explain how I ended up on that little stage, sold like a party favor in front of everyone we knew, because it wasn't one night that did it. It was 29 years, and it happened the way erosion happens, a grain at a time, so slow you never see the coastline change until one morning half the beach is gone. By the time Richard put a price on me in public, I'd already spent decades being priced privately, and I'd stopped arguing about the number. I had spent that entire day making the event happen. Every centerpiece. The seating chart I'd redrawn 4 times because 2 donors had stopped speaking to each other over a boundary fence. The 3 calls to the caterer, who kept confusing the vegetarian count. All of that was mine. It had been mine for the last 9 years, ever since Richard's development firm grew big enough that the annual charity night moved out of a hotel back room and into the grand ballroom downtown. I never asked to have my name on it. I told myself over and over that some people build the room and some people shine in it, and I had made peace with which one I was. That's the story I fed myself. Looking back, I think a person can talk themselves into almost anything if they're lonely enough and patient enough. Richard arrived 40 minutes late, the way he always arrived now, sweeping through the doors with that warm, easy expression that made a room tilt toward him. He kissed my cheek in front of 2 board members. He said something about how I always managed to pull the whole thing together, which sounded like a compliment if you didn't listen closely. Then he spent the next hour taking credit for choices I'd made alone, right down to the wine I'd picked because his usual supplier had let us down and I'd found a better one myself. Years ago, that would have bruised me for a week. By that night, I barely felt it land. You'd be amazed what a person learns to stop feeling. The jokes started during dinner, the way they always did once he'd had 2 glasses of the good scotch he liked kept within arm's reach. He told the table I was hopelessly behind the times, that I still kept a paper address book, that I'd probably never sent a text longer than 5 words in my life. People laughed, and I laughed too, because that is the choreography, and passed the bread to Helen Marsh from the Historical Society, who patted my wrist like she pitied me. Somehow her pity stung worse than his joke. "She's the quietest woman in any room she walks into," Richard said at one point, loud enough that 2 neighboring tables turned to hear. And I say that with love. He always tacked that on. With love. Like a receipt stapled to the cruelty to prove it had been a legitimate purchase. I don't know exactly whose idea the auction was. Richard's partner, Doug, runs those bachelor auctions at other charity nights, the kind where local weathermen get bid on for a dinner date. All in good fun, all for the cause. Somebody at our table thought it would be hilarious to try one with married couples instead. Somebody thought Richard should go first. Somebody handed him the band's microphone. I remember him taking my hand halfway through dessert and pulling me up onto the small stage where the quartet had been playing. And I remember, in the half-second before I understood, actually letting myself hope he meant to say something kind. A toast. A thank you. A single true sentence about the woman who'd built the evening around him. Instead, he set his hand on my shoulder like I was a lamp he was selling at an estate sale, and he said the words, "We'll start the bidding at $20. The room laughed the way rooms laugh when the wine has done its work and they trust the man with the microphone. I looked out at 300 faces. I had fed most of them. I'd remembered their anniversaries and sent handwritten notes when their parents passed and sat through their children's engagement speeches. Every one of them was laughing while my husband auctioned me for the price of a sandwich. I did not run. I did not throw my glass, though some small and exhausted part of me wanted to hear it shatter. I stood with my back straight and my hands folded, and I let it wash over me, because a long time ago I'd figured out one true thing about dignity. Nobody in a laughing room can take it from you. You can only hand it over. And I had decided somewhere between the salad and the sorbet that I was done handing it over. A man near the bar raised his paddle. 20, he called, and got his laugh. That was when the voice came from the back. $1 million. Calm, unhurried. The voice of someone who has never once in his life had to raise it to be heard. Every head in that ballroom turned at the same moment. Richard's hand slid off my shoulder like it had gone cold. I found the source of the voice near the entrance, a tall man in a charcoal suit I'd never seen before, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. Not amusement, not pity, something closer to relief, which made no sense to me at all, because I had never laid eyes on him in my life. Richard laughed, one short, nervous bark, and said something about a generous surprise donor. Nobody was listening to him. The man in charcoal had already started walking toward the stage, and the crowd was parting for him without being asked, the way a crowd parts for the one person in the room who seems certain of where he's going. My heart began to pound, not from fear, from the sudden bone-deep sense that my life was about to change and I would have no vote in how. He stopped a few feet from the stage. Up close he was older than I'd guessed, maybe 55, with silver coming in at the temples, and a stillness about him that made everyone nearby seem loud and overdressed. He didn't glance at Richard once. He looked only at me. "My name is Julian Marsh," he said. A ripple went through the crowd behind me, a soft collective intake of breath. The name clearly meant something to everyone in that ballroom except me. "Forgive the interruption," he said. Richard found his voice and stepped forward with his hand out and his salesman's smile snapping back into place. "Julian Marsh, of course. We're honored. We had no idea you'd be joining us tonight. Your support for the foundation over the years has been—" "I didn't come for your foundation." Julian's tone stayed even, but something in it made Richard's outstretched hand lower on its own. "I came because I heard your wife would be here. You could have heard a pin drop into carpet. I heard ice settle in a glass 3 tables away." Richard glanced at me, waiting for me to explain the strange man who'd just bid $1 million on a joke my husband had started. "I'm sorry," he said. "Have the two of you met? Vivian, do you know Mr. Marsh?" "No," I said, because it was true, and because in 29 years I'd never given Richard a single reason to doubt my word, and I wasn't about to start in front of 300 people. Julian turned fully to me then, and his face did something quiet, the way a face softens when a long drive is finally over and the porch light is on. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "I know how this must look. It isn't what you think." He glanced at the microphone still hanging in Richard's hand, then back at me. "Would you let me buy you lunch tomorrow? There's something I need to tell you, and it doesn't belong in a room like this one." Every instinct I'd spent decades sharpening told me to smooth it over. Protect the evening. Protect Richard, even now, even after what he'd just done. But I looked at Julian Marsh, and I saw something aimed at me that I hadn't seen aimed my way in longer than I could remember. Not tolerance, not fondness on his better days, plain, uncomplicated respect. "All right," I said. "Tomorrow." The whispers followed us off the stage. I caught fragments as Richard steered me back to our table with a hand pressed a little too hard between my shoulder blades. Who was that? $1 million. For her? And I understood, in a distant sort of way, that I had just become the most interesting thing to happen at one of Richard's galas in 9 years, and not for any reason he'd have chosen. He waited until the valet had brought the car, and we'd pulled out onto the boulevard before he asked the question I'd felt building in him since the ballroom. "Do you know him?" His voice was careful, a man trying hard to sound like a man who wasn't worried. "No, Richard. I told you the truth in there. I've never met him." $1 million, Vivian. For a joke. That isn't normal. People don't do that. His hands tightened on the wheel like it owed him an answer. "Did you cross paths with him somewhere? The pharmacy, the club, one of your little volunteer things?" "I have no idea who he is," I said again. And I meant it, though even as I said it, some part of me had already begun turning the evening over in my mind, feeling along its edges for the seam I hadn't found yet. He didn't believe me. I could tell by how quiet he went for the rest of the drive, and by the way he disappeared into his study the moment we got home instead of coming up to bed. I lay awake a long time, staring at the ceiling, replaying that voice. $1 million. I searched my memory for it and came up empty. I had genuinely never met the man. What I didn't know, lying there with the thin line of light from Richard's study glowing under the hallway door, was that he'd already phoned Carol, his executive assistant, from the car. I didn't know he'd told her to find out everything there was to know about Julian Marsh before morning, his companies, his marriages, and above all, any thread that tied the man's name to mine. And I certainly didn't know that by sunrise, Carol would call back with something that rattled Richard far worse than an affair ever could have. Proof that Julian Marsh had been quietly looking for a woman named Vivian for the better part of 3 years. Julian chose a small place I'd never heard of, tucked down a side street away from the restaurants where Richard liked to be seen. The tables sat far enough apart that a conversation stayed a conversation. He stood when I walked in, which almost no one did for me anymore, and he pulled out my chair before the host could reach it. For a while after we'd ordered, he didn't speak. He just studied me across the little vase of daisies with an expression I still couldn't name. "I owe you an apology for last night," he finally said. "I know it looked theatrical. That wasn't the plan. I've been trying to find you for a long time, and when I walked in and saw what your husband was doing, I couldn't make myself stand there and watch it." "You still haven't told me how you know me," I said. "I've gone back over every year of my life since you sat down, and I can't find you in any of them." "You wouldn't find me," he said, "but if I tell you the story, I think you'll find someone else." He took a slow breath, the kind people take before they say a thing they've rehearsed in their head for years. 31 years ago, he said, you worked at the public library on Ashmore Street, the old branch, the one they knocked down in the 90s. Something shifted in my chest, a door easing open on a room I hadn't walked into in decades. "I did," I said slowly. "My first real job. I ran the children's section and closed on weeknights." "There was a boy," Julian said. "He came in almost every afternoon that winter, 10, maybe 11, thin. His clothes never matched the weather. He'd sit in the back corner near the atlases until you locked up, and some nights, if it was cold, you'd let him stay a little past closing while you finished shelving. You kept crackers in your desk drawer. You'd slide him a sleeve of them without ever once making it a thing." I set down my water glass. My hand wasn't quite steady. "There was a boy," I said. "I remember him. He wouldn't tell me his name for the longest time. His mother worked nights, I think. He didn't want to go home to an empty apartment. I could see him now, clearer than I'd have expected, hunched over a book of maps of places he'd never been, tracing rivers with one finger. He loved the atlas. He wanted to know how far it was to everywhere." "His name was Julian," the man across the table said quietly. "That boy was me." I don't know how long I sat there. The restaurant seemed to go very quiet around us. "My father had left," Julian said. "My mother, Rosa, was cleaning offices from 6 at night until 4 in the morning. She'd come home and sleep while I was at school, and by the time I got out, she was gone again. Some weeks there wasn't much food in the apartment. I wasn't allowed to say so. She was proud, and she was terrified that if the wrong person knew, they'd take me away from her." He turned his glass slowly on the table. "So I went to the library. It was warm, it was free, and there was a woman there who never once looked at me like I was a problem she had to solve. You just handed me crackers and asked me what I was reading." I remembered the crackers. I remembered a night I'd walked him partway home in the snow because he had no gloves, and I'd given him mine and told him to keep them because I had another pair, which wasn't true. "You gave me your gloves," he said, as if he'd heard the thought. "I did," I whispered. "I still have them." He said it plainly, without any drama, and that somehow made it harder to bear. "I kept them for 30 years. My mother kept them after that." He reached into his jacket and set an envelope on the table between us. He didn't open it. "She died 4 months ago," he said. "Her heart. She was 78, and she was clear as a bell right up to the end." His voice held steady, but I saw what it cost him. "In the last week, she made me promise her one thing. She said, 'Find the library woman, the one who fed you when I couldn't. Tell her it mattered. Tell her I never stopped being grateful.'" I put my hand over my mouth. I hadn't cried in that ballroom, not through the laughter or the auction or my own husband naming a price for me. But I cried now, quietly, at a little table over a plate I hadn't touched, for a boy I'd nearly forgotten and a debt I never once knew I was carrying. "The $1 million wasn't charity," Julian said gently. "I need you to understand that. It had nothing to do with your husband's foundation, and I didn't do it to humiliate him, though I'll admit I didn't mind that part. I did it because for 30 years, every person in your life has decided what you're worth without ever really looking at you. I wanted a room full of them to hear the truth said out loud, once, at a price they couldn't laugh off." I wiped my eyes with the napkin. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything today." He slid the envelope across the table. "This is from my mother. She wrote it before she passed in case I ever found you. I haven't read it. It isn't mine to read." I held it in both hands like it might come apart if I gripped too hard. And sitting there, with the daisies between us and the first spatter of rain starting on the window, I understood that whatever was inside was going to reshape my life. I just didn't yet know by how much. I opened it alone, in the guest room, where I'd started sleeping since the night of the gala, because I couldn't stand to read a dying woman's last words with Richard's voice carrying through the wall, asking again and again who Julian Marsh really was to me. The handwriting was small and neat, the careful print of a woman who'd learned English as an adult and taken pride in getting every letter right. "Dear Vivian," it began, "if you are reading this, then my son kept his promise, and I hope it was not too late. I want you to know that the woman who fed my boy when I could not is the reason he grew up believing the world had good people in it. I could not always show him that. I was too tired and too afraid. You showed him for me. Everything he became partly because of an hour a day in a warm room with a kind woman and a sleeve of crackers. I have asked my son to make sure you are never invisible again. Please let him. This is not payment. You never asked for anything. It is proof that kindness does not vanish. It only takes the long way home." Folded behind the letter were documents I had to read twice before they made sense. Rosa hadn't left me money, not directly. What Julian had arranged, at his mother's request, was something I never in my life expected to be offered: a permanent seat on the board of the Marsh Family Foundation and the directorship of a new program he was building in her name. The Rosa Marsh Reading Initiative, libraries in neighborhoods that had lost theirs, after-school rooms with food on the table and no questions asked, scholarships for kids who read their way out of apartments like the one Julian grew up in, leadership, purpose, a real say in where a great deal of money went every year toward children exactly like the boy I'd once handed crackers to across a library desk. I sat on the edge of that unfamiliar bed for a long while, holding papers that made my own hands feel like they belonged to a stranger. Downstairs, my husband was building something too. His was nowhere near as generous. Richard had hired a private investigator by Wednesday, a man named Prewitt, who Carol told me specialized in divorce work. Richard was convinced, in the way a guilty man is often certain of everyone else's guilt, that Julian and I shared a history he simply hadn't dug up yet, an affair, something sordid enough to explain $1 million in a private lunch. He wanted his proof before I could, in his words, ambush him in front of the lawyers. What Prewitt found instead unsettled Richard far more than an affair would have. He found 2 teachers from the elementary school near our old neighborhood who remembered a woman who tutored their strugglers for free on Thursday mornings for the better part of a decade. He found a woman named Dolores, a widow I'd driven to her chemotherapy appointments every other week for 2 years, back when Richard was too busy landing his first big development to notice I was gone most Tuesday afternoons. He found a man named Sam, a veteran who told Prewitt that I was the one who sat with him at the benefits office for a whole afternoon until the clerk finally found the file the VA swore didn't exist. He found a grown woman, once a foster kid, who described a librarian who used to set aside the new arrivals for her because she couldn't afford books of her own. None of it was scandal. None of it was dramatic. It was just decades of small, unremarkable kindnesses that had never once come up at Richard's dinner table, because I'd never thought them worth mentioning, and he had never once asked what I did with the hours that weren't spent orbiting him. Prewitt's report landed on Richard's desk the same week the video went up. I don't know who filmed it. Some guest with a phone, probably, capturing the auction the way people capture everything now without a second thought. But by Thursday, the clip of Richard holding that microphone and grinning and saying we'll start the bidding at $20 had been watched more than 4 million times. The captions people added were not kind, neither were the comments. A late-night host worked it into his monologue. A women's advocacy account reposted it with a line about what casual contempt looks like when it wears a tuxedo, and that version alone crossed 1 million views by Friday. A morning show ran a segment titled The $20 Wife. The calls started coming into the firm. 2 investors who'd put money into Richard's waterfront project the previous spring had their lawyers quietly review the exit clauses. A hotel group that had been days from signing on a new development paused everything, citing, in the polished language of people withdrawing carefully, concerns about brand fit. A reporter who covered the gala for a regional business magazine reached out to me directly for comment. I declined. I had nothing prepared and no interest in saying anything I hadn't thought through. Richard came home Friday looking like a man who'd aged 5 years in 5 days. He didn't ask about Julian. He didn't ask about the envelope I kept locked in the guest room dresser. He sat at the kitchen island with his phone face down and said very quietly, "It's everywhere, Vivian. I can't make it stop." I didn't answer right away. I thought about Rosa's letter upstairs, about a warm room and a sleeve of crackers and how differently the last 30 years might have gone for the man in front of me if he'd ever once wondered what I did with mine. The phone rang before I could decide what to say. Richard answered, listened, and I watched the last of the color leave his face. "The board wants an emergency meeting," he said. "Monday. All of them." The meeting ran 90 minutes, and Richard told me about it that night in pieces, the way a man describes something he's still too stunned to put in order. 7 directors around the long table in the glass-walled conference room he used to be so proud of, the one with the harbor view he liked to show new clients. Not one of them would quite meet his eye. It was Warren Cole, the oldest of them, who finally said the thing the rest were only thinking. "This isn't about a joke, Richard. Jokes blow over. This is about what the joke told everyone you are when you think no one important is looking." The 2 investors circling the exit clauses made it official by Monday afternoon. The hotel group walked entirely. By Wednesday, the firm had lost enough projected value that Richard stopped saying numbers to me at all. On Thursday, he came to me holding a television offer like a life raft. A morning show wanted us both, Richard and Vivian Hale, side by side on a soft couch, setting the record straight. He'd already told the producer yes. He wanted me to sit there and smile and tell the country it had all been an inside joke between us, that I hadn't been hurt, that we were fine. I looked at him a long moment before I answered. "I won't lie for anyone anymore, Richard, not even you." He didn't shout. I think some part of him had already stopped expecting me to say yes to the things he asked. He just sat down heavily and put his head in his hands, and for the first time in longer than I could recall, I felt something close to pity for him. Not enough to change my answer, but something. I called Julian later that week, not about the interview, but about the letter, about the strange new weight I didn't yet know how to carry. He didn't try to talk me into anything. He just said, "Take all the time you need. If you ever want to see what the work actually looks like, come with me to one of the reading rooms." I said yes before I'd fully thought it through. The place was smaller than I expected, a storefront on the east side that had been a laundromat until the foundation bought it. Somebody had painted a mural of a whale on the back wall and filled the shelves with donated books. The spines cracked and loved. Julian introduced me to the director, a warm, unhurried woman named Delia, who walked me through the room and told me who came and how often and what they never had enough of. That's where I met Alicia. She was maybe 26, sitting at a low table with a boy of about 5 asleep in her lap and a workbook open in front of her that she clearly couldn't get through. She had the particular exhaustion I recognized on sight. Not tiredness exactly. The specific depletion of someone who has spent every scrap of herself keeping a small person fed and warm and unaware of how close to the edge things really are. She looked up at me the way people look up when they've long since learned not to expect anything good from a stranger, and something in her face reminded me so precisely of a hungry boy tracing rivers across an atlas that I had to steady myself against a bookshelf. I sat down beside her. I didn't ask her story. I asked what she was working on, and she said her GED math, and that she kept failing the practice test, and that she was about to give up. So I pulled a chair around, and we did 3 problems together, slowly, and when the boy woke up hungry, I walked to the corner store and came back with a sandwich and a carton of milk and let her decide, in her own time, how much of the rest she wanted to tell me. It came out in pieces. A partner who drank, a shelter 2 towns over with no beds, 6 weeks of sleeping in a cousin's basement before Delia's room gave her somewhere to spend her days. I listened the way I'd learned to listen decades earlier, without flinching, without rushing her toward a tidier version. Before I left that afternoon, I'd arranged, through the foundation, to cover the cost of her GED course and a month of childcare so she could actually finish it. It wasn't a large thing, not by the numbers Rose's foundation dealt in, but driving home, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not decorative, not a place setting at somebody else's table. Useful. There isn't a better word for it. He saw the change before I said a word about it. He saw it in the way I stopped checking his calendar before I made my own plans, in the way I quit glancing at my phone for his approval before deciding what mattered to me. One evening, he watched me come in late from a foundation meeting, lit up in a way he hadn't seen in a long time, and he said it quietly, almost to himself. "You don't need any of this anymore, do you? Me, the house, none of it." I didn't answer right away because I was still learning the answer myself, but I understood, watching his face in the kitchen light, that he already knew, and that some part of him had known it was coming since long before that microphone ever reached his hand. The invitation came in a heavy cream envelope with my name in gold. Beneath my name was a line I read 3 times before I let myself believe it. Keynote speaker, Vivian Hale. I called Julian, half sure it was a mistake. "It's no mistake," he said, and I could hear him smiling. The board voted, unanimous. They want the founder's story told by the person who started it, whether she knew she was starting anything or not. I nearly said no. Standing in front of a crowd was never the part I wanted. I'd spent a lifetime being useful from the edges of rooms, not the middle of them. But I thought of Alicia, 3 weeks from her exam now, texting me a photo of a practice test with a 78 circled at the top and 4 exclamation points and nothing else. I thought of Rose's letter in my dresser. Kindness does not vanish. It only takes the long way home. I said yes. The night of the gala, I dressed alone, in the small apartment I'd moved into 6 weeks after telling Richard I needed room to think. I chose a deep green dress, nothing like the pearl gray from that other ballroom in another life. I did my own hair. I did not check my phone once to see whether anyone approved. This time, when I walked into a room of 300 people, I wasn't seated beside a man with a microphone. I was walking toward a stage where my name was already printed in the program. Julian met me at the door and offered his arm, the way an old friend walks you into a room you're nervous about, steady and unhurried. "You don't have to say much," he told me. "Just tell them the truth. That's the only thing my mother ever wanted from anybody." They called my name and I climbed the steps without shaking, though my heart was going the whole way up. I looked out at the crowd, donors, former board members, a scattering of faces I recognized from the reading rooms we now ran in 6 cities. And I told them about a cold library on Ashmore Street, about a boy who came in every afternoon to trace rivers across an atlas, about a sleeve of crackers I'd slid across a desk without once thinking it was worth remembering. I told them I hadn't understood it as anything at the time, and I told them that this, I'd come to believe, was exactly the point. The kindnesses that change a life almost never announce themselves as important while they're happening. They feel like nothing. They feel like a Tuesday. Then the lights dimmed, and the screen behind me filled with faces. Dolores, the widow, older now, talking about a woman who drove her to chemotherapy for 2 years and never once made her feel like a burden. Sam, the veteran, talking about the afternoon at the benefits office. A grown woman who'd been a foster child, now a school librarian herself, saying she stacked the new arrivals aside for the kids who couldn't buy their own because someone had once done it for her. A teacher I hadn't seen in 15 years, crying openly, describing free tutoring on Thursday mornings. Alicia came last, her son beside her. She said just one thing. She sat down next to me when I was ready to quit. That's all. She just sat down until it stopped feeling impossible. I pressed my hand to my mouth to hold my own composure, and I looked out into the dark of the room. And I found Richard, near the back, alone, in a seat he must have asked for quietly, without any expectation of being noticed. He wasn't wearing the smile he kept for cameras. He was simply watching, very still, the way I had once stood very still on a stage he built for me. Afterward, as the crowd thinned and the staff cleared the tables, he found me near the coat check. He didn't try to charm his way into the moment the way the old Richard would have. I watched all of it, he said. The screen, the people. 29 years Vivian and I never once asked what you did with your Tuesday afternoons. His voice caught a little on the word Tuesday, and I understood he was thinking of Dolores, and of all the small absences he'd never questioned because he'd never wondered where I went. I'm sorry, he said. Not the kind of sorry that wants something back. Just sorry. I stood next to someone remarkable for almost 30 years, and I never looked up long enough to see her. I believed him. That was the strangest part of the whole evening, that after all of it I could still tell the difference between one of Richard's performances and an honest reckoning, and this was the second thing. Thank you for saying that, I told him, and I meant it. I forgive you, Richard. I want you to know that. But forgiving you isn't the same as coming back. He nodded slowly, like a man finally accepting the shape of something he'd been trying for weeks to bend into a different shape. He didn't argue. He didn't ask me to reconsider. He stood there in his good suit, looking older than I'd ever seen him, and let me say goodnight. I walked out into a cool evening full of the particular quiet that settles after something true has finally been said out loud. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, being alone in it didn't feel like a loss. It felt like the front edge of something that belonged entirely to me. Change came the way real change usually does, in increments too small to notice until you turn around and see the distance. The Rosa Marsh Reading Initiative opened 4 new rooms that year, one of them in a town that hadn't had a library branch in a decade. The scholarship program grew from a handful of kids to more than 30. Alicia passed her GED in the spring and started a medical assistant course 3 weeks later. She sent me a photo of her acceptance letter with the same 4 exclamation points and nothing else, and I taped it inside my desk drawer, where I'd once kept crackers for a boy who wanted to know how far it was to everywhere. I had a purpose now that didn't wait on anyone's permission. That was the part I hadn't known to hope for. Richard stepped down as chairman that same spring. It surprised the people who didn't know the whole story. It didn't surprise me. The board hadn't forced him out in the end. The numbers had partly recovered, the way outrage cools if you wait long enough. He resigned. He told me over coffee, one of the last times we spoke as anything like a married couple, because he didn't want to spend the rest of his life as a man who only found decency after losing everything that had made him comfortable. He wanted to build something smaller and honest, even if it meant starting over at 56 with a fraction of what he'd had. We separated with more grace than either of us had shown the other in years. No shouting through lawyers. No carving up the furniture like spoils. 2 people finally telling each other the truth, signing papers in a quiet office and shaking hands afterward like colleagues closing out a long, complicated project. He asked me, before I left that office for the last time as his wife, whether I thought we could have been happy if he'd simply paid attention sooner. I told him I didn't know, and that I'd stopped needing to know. I think that answer surprised him more than anger would have. There's one more thing I want to tell you. On a slow Thursday last autumn, I stayed late at the reading room on Ashmore, the new one the foundation had built 2 blocks from where the old library once stood before they knocked it down. I was reshelving the way I used to at 23 when I noticed I wasn't alone. A boy was tucked into the far corner near the geography section, maybe 10 years old, a school backpack at his feet, pretending very hard to be invisible. He had the specific stillness of a child who has learned that being noticed rarely goes well for him. I knew that stillness. I'd seen it once before, 31 years ago, in a hungry boy tracing rivers he'd never get to see, and I'd apparently carried the shape of it in me every year since without knowing I had. I didn't ask why he wasn't home. I walked to my desk, where I still keep a sleeve of crackers in the top drawer. Some habits outlast the reasons for them, and I slid it onto the table beside him without making it a thing. That's a good corner, I said. The atlases are the best books in here, if you ask me. Do you want to see how far it is to everywhere? He looked at me, wary, and then something in his shoulders let go, the way a held breath finally lets go. He nodded. And the thing that started with a warm room and a sleeve of crackers 3 decades ago began again, quietly, the way it always does. No audience, no microphone, no one keeping score. Sometimes people laugh while they decide what you're worth. They hold up the microphone. They set the price. They wait for the room to agree. But time has a way of settling the real account, long after the laughter fades and the room empties out. And when it finally does, you learn the truth of it. Kindness is always worth more than the people who mock it could ever afford to pay. I want to know what you think happens to Vivian from here. Does she ever let someone new into her heart, or has she found everything she needs in the life she built for herself? Tell me in the comments below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. We've got so many more stories like this one on the way, so make sure you subscribe so you never miss a single one. Let's keep this journey going together.